We should probably get started. Good morning. I'm Bridget Donahue. I'm the Director of Real Estate for the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe, and I'm also on the Board of Directors for the National Tribal Land Association. So welcome to the 9th Annual Tribal Land Staff National Conference. And I just wanted to say that lunch is going to be served at noon in the main ballroom, just to the left here, or my left, you're right. This is Judy Kurtzman, and she graduated from Utah State University with a master's degree in forest resources and environmental law, along with a graduate certificate in natural resource and environmental policy. She received her undergraduate degree from the University of Minnesota with a dual major in sociology and anthropology. Her teaching experience has included teaching courses on the Utah State University campus, both on NEPA for undergraduate and graduate level students, and an Introduction to Environmental Law and Policy course for graduate students. For the last 10 years, she has also taught courses that apply to Utah State's NEPA certificate program for the Shipley Group as a private consultant. Currently, she is working full-time teaching for Shipley Group Incorporated. Courses taught include applying the NEPA process and writing effective NEPA documents, clear writing for NEPA specialists, science communication and technical writing, cumulative impact analysis and documentation, climate change analysis and documentation, cultural and natural resource management, ESA and Section 7 overview, managing NEPA projects and teams, and reviewing NEPA documents. Thank you, Judy, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Appreciate it. That was probably more information than you needed. I'm not very good at standing in one place. Can you hear me okay? Mike, okay, good. And I really don't like microphones. I always feel like I have a loud enough voice. I don't need them, but this is a pretty big room. So I welcome all of you, and I'm glad you're here. And I have to apologize. I didn't know how many people would be here, and I only brought 20 booklets. So the first 20 people who came in got them. And if you really want one, give me your name and your address, and I will send you one if you didn't get it. And we will kind of be using them, but you can get by without it. It was more something to help you have a reference to. So is there anybody in this room who would say that they know NEPA pretty well and they're pretty comfortable with it? Okay, that's okay, because I developed, I put this together. Trying to teach NEPA, do I have an hour and a half? Okay, I had put down 60 minutes, so I'm glad I get the extra half an hour. Trying to teach NEPA in an hour and a half is sort of like trying when you buy something, you take it out of the box and then you try and put it back again. It just never seems to fit. I'm not going to fit, enough information in an hour and a half for you guys to walk out of here and go, oh, I know NEPA now. I'm going to give you enough information to say, oh, I'm going to have to do some reading and learn some more about this, okay? I will say, so I teach 16 different environmental laws, and NEPA is my favorite environmental law. And I say that because it's the law. So first of all, rather than just focusing on one aspect of the environment, of an ecosystem, it makes us look at the entire ecosystem as a whole. And it includes people as part of the ecosystem instead of excluding them like most laws will do. And you've got the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the National Historic Preservation Act and the Archaeological Resources Protection Act. And they all look at just one aspect of the environment. NEPA says you have to take all of those things and look at them all together, and if you're going to have effects, adverse or beneficial effects on any aspect of that ecosystem, including the people who are using that ecosystem, then you have to do an analysis to look at what the level of effect might be and how that's going to affect the people So while NEPA is an environmental policy act, it's the National Environmental Policy Act, not protection. A lot of people get confused with that. It's not a protection act, it's a policy act. It boils down to people. It boils down to how do these actions affect the ecosystems that people are living in and how they're using them. And I have a little, if the Supreme Court had asked me when they made the decision to say that NEPA is a procedural law, I would have disagreed with that. And I'll show you why when we look at the regulations and we look at the act itself a little bit. So I think NEPA, and if you're staying for the next session, it's really about using NEPA as a planning process. It's really about using NEPA to be sure you encompass the entire environment and you understand that domino effect that happens when you're working in ecosystems. So you remove vegetation, you remove, I hate standing here. You remove vegetation, can I turn that on? I'm just not a formal person. Is that on? Now is it on? Can you hear me? Okay. NEPA is what did I just say? What was I just talking about? Yeah, did you say that? Smart aleck. Yeah, the domino. Thank you. So you remove vegetation, you have an effect on soils. When you have an effect on soils, they often find their way into rivers and creeks and lakes, and then the sediment and the other total suspended solids, leaves, other things, also go into that lake or river or stream, and then that affects water quality, and it changes water temperatures. And when you change water quality and you change water temperatures, then you have an effect on the aquatic wildlife within there. And when you have an effect on the aquatic wildlife within there, then you have an effect on terrestrial wildlife that might be dependent on aquatic wildlife. Or you have an effect on anglers or hunters or pure recreationists who want to go hiking or biking or whatever in the area. And then you might have an effect on the economics in the local community because people stop coming there to hunt and fish. So you've got this domino effect, and that's what NEPA wants you to analyze is where does it stop? And where can you put what are called mitigation measures in there so you can reduce impacts so that you can reduce that impact to water quality so it doesn't affect aquatic wildlife, which then in turn doesn't affect terrestrial wildlife, et cetera. So that is what NEPA is about. It's about looking at the whole environment and taking the big picture approach to your actions so you can truly understand what they mean to the entire ecosystem. And that's why I like it. Do I point this at that or at do I point it at that? Do I point this at that? Shouldn't matter. Well, look at that. So, NEPA was passed it was passed December 23rd by Congress in 1969 and signed by President Nixon on January 1st, 1970. And when he did the State of the Union that year in January, this is what he said about the passage of NEPA. The great question is, shall we make peace with nature and begin to make reparations for the damage we have done to our air, our land, and our water? Clean air, clean water, open spaces, these should once again be the birthright of every American. The price tag is high. Through the years of past carelessness, we have incurred debt to nature. Now that debt is being called. So NEPA was the result of, make sure I have it there. NEPA was the result of the actions that we took starting after World War, well, starting before then, but particularly after World War II, when we decided to ensure that we would improve the quality of life for most Americans in the United States. So they started putting roads in from north to south, east to west, and everywhere in between. We started coal-burning facilities for electricity. We started damming rivers for electricity. We brought electricity into most people's homes. We brought indoor plumbing into most people's homes. And as we were doing this, it was improving the quality of life for many Americans, but we weren't taking a good look at what we were doing to the environment. So by 1960, and they tried to pass NEPA for 16 years before it actually got passed. By 1969, so in the summer of 1969, the Cuyahoga River in Ohio started on fire, and it burned for over half an hour. And all it took was a train going over a bridge and a spark from that train hitting the track, falling into the river, burst into flames because it was so polluted. And at that time, 2/3 of the waters in the United States were no longer fishable or swimmable. So, and it made frontline papers across the nation. And then there was an oil spill in the fall of 1969 that off the coast of Santa Barbara that also made headlines. People were really concerned, and so Congress decided, and then of course we had the Vietnam War going on, and we'd had the protests in the summer of 1968, and so people started to really question whether our government was looking out for the health and welfare of the citizens, or whether they were more inclined to be looking out for the health and welfare of big business. And so they decided they needed to pass some kind of an environmental policy for the federal government to ensure that the federal government was doing the least amount of damage possible to the environment when they were taking actions. So they passed NEPA, thinking that it would be a fairly easy law for federal agencies to comply with. So keep in mind, you have to have a federal nexus of some sort for NEPA to be applying to actions on your lands. Usually it's funding or it's permitting, but it can also be a federal agency taking an action on your land, although they can't do that on your lands without your permission. So it's federal actions, federal funding, and federal permits. That's the federal nexus that requires NEPA to be done before a federal action can be taken. No, it has to, no, because that's, oh, I'm sorry, the question what, yeah. If it's trust lands, is that why NEPA applies? And that is not why NEPA applies. There has to be something more than the fact that it's trust lands. It's usually due to funding or the permitting of like oil and gas or mining. So, so when the act was passed, there was this thought that NEPA would be fairly easy to comply with, and then over the years, the courts enforced NEPA. For the first 8 years, it was the courts who really defined and interpreted NEPA. And they gave it a lot more, what's the word I want to use? They gave it a lot more strength or a lot more substance. That's the word I'm looking for. They gave it a lot more substance than I think Congress had intended. But it was a good thing in the long run, because that substance that they gave it meant that it really made a difference. And if NEPA is used right, it really does make a difference in how actions are taken because, like I said, and I'm going to drill this into you, the purpose of NEPA, the goal of NEPA and the purpose of NEPA, as we'll see in a little bit, are for federal agencies to figure out how to take actions with the least amount of damage to the environment, including the humans within the environment possible. So, NEPA compliance, there's Section 101, and we're going to look at that. There's Section 102. There's the Council on Environmental Quality, which is called CEQ, the CEQ implementing regulations, the National Historic Preservation Act. And you might say, well, wait a minute, that's its own act. And it is its own act, but they are sister laws, and they are very similar in nature. In fact, NEPA plagiarized some of the language from the National Historic Preservation Act. And you can't comply, you can't complete your compliance with NEPA until you've completed your compliance with the National Historic Preservation Act. And I'm going to say it now. So that means that you cannot see in a NEPA document under cultural resources, we will consult with the tribes before we break ground. That's illegal. It has to say, our consultation with the tribes, these are the tribes that were involved, here's when the consultation was completed, and the memorandum of agreement that we signed is in Appendix A. So, and I see it all the time. I see documents, and I've had huge arguments with federal agencies about this, but it's very clear that the courts and there's a law, and I think it's the FARA law or the FAR law that says you must complete all consultations before a final NEPA document can be issued and before any decisions can be made. So that consultation must be completed under the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106, before any NEPA, before any decisions are made and any NEPA decision documents are issued. There's the government-to-government consultation requirements, and then there's the focus of consultation and how it affects treaty rights that pertain to wildlife, vegetation, water quality, et cetera. So a lot of times the focus is always on cultural resources when it comes to tribes, but that shouldn't be the only focus that the agencies are taking. And that shouldn't be the only focus that the tribes are taking. It should include how is it affecting your treaty rights and how is it affecting your water quality, your habitat for wildlife, your vegetation in general from those indirect or downriver impacts. So, and that's something that I want to talk about because, where did I put it? I'm so not used to having one of these. So in Section 101, the spirit of the law. Can I borrow one of your books? Do you mind? Okay. So for those of you who have it, flip back, and I'm sorry, I just walked in front of this, I'm sorry. Flip back to Appendix A, which is going to start on page 60. So on if you have one of these, and if you can share it with the person next to you, that would be nice. You will see that there is the purpose to the act, which is section 2. We can look at it together if you want. So it says, the purposes of this act are to declare a national policy which will encourage productive and enjoyable harmony between man and his environment, to promote efforts which will prevent or eliminate damage to the environment and biosphere and stimulate the health and welfare of man, to enrich the understanding of the ecological systems and natural resources important to the nation, and to establish a council on environmental quality. Okay, so what I want you to note from that is this concept of productive and enjoyable harmony. So if you drop down to section 101, this is the goal of NEPA, okay? So the goals of NEPA, the Congress recognizing the profound impact on man's activity in the interrelations of all components of the natural environment, particularly the profound influences of population growth, high-density urbanization, industrial expansion, resource exploitation, and new and expanding technological advances, and recognizing further the critical overall welfare and development of man, declares that it is the continuing policy of the federal government in cooperation with state and local governments and other concerned public and private organizations to use all practicable means and measures, including financial and technical assistance, in a manner calculated to foster and promote the general welfare, to create and maintain conditions under which man and nature can exist in productive harmony and fulfill social, economic, and other requirements of present and future generations of Americans. So if you notice in both the purpose and the goal, that term, productive harmony, is stated twice. It's a really important concept. It's a really important concept to NEPA. And it's something that if you're going to do NEPA right, you have to understand it. So what does it mean? What does it mean to you when you hear the term productive harmony? What does that mean to you? Somebody be brave. Jump in there. No, say it again. I'm going to fall. I guarantee I'll fall on my face before the... Making music with nature? Actually, yeah. I mean, that's where you got the harmony, right? Yeah. And when you say that, when you're making music with nature, what are you doing? What are you doing when you're making music with nature? Think about it.
Well, we are assured that wildlife is protected, rivers flow freely, that's good.
Yeah, so you're ensuring that it's healthy and that it's happy and it wants to sing with you and it wants to work with you, right? So when note, he said, and you're being productive. So when you have productive harmony with nature, it means, yeah, you might harvest timber, but you can harvest timber in a way that allows you to have timber, but also allows the forest to continue to serve as habitat, to continue to hold the soils down, continues to allow for additional growth. So you can do your job as a timber harvester and harvest timber, but with the least amount of damage possible, so that it continues to sing with you, it continues to work with you. a lot of people use that term sustainability, and I have to admit, I'm a little uncomfortable with the term because there's so many different meanings to it, and I have really no clue which one is right, so I don't really know what that means. But I do know what it means to say, do your job, but figure out how to ensure that you take the environment, the natural environment that we all depend on, into consideration and figure out how to do what you need to do, reducing or avoiding impacts to the natural world and the physical world as much as possible. So when you're looking, whether you're doing a NEPA document, whether you're reviewing a NEPA document, that's one of the first things I look at. Are we doing that? Are we meeting this requirement of NEPA, this goal of NEPA of productive harmony? Now, the only part of this law the only part of the purpose and the goals that the courts have enforced is the public involvement part, where it says that you have to work with other federal government in cooperation with state, local governments, and other concerned public and private organizations, and that's us. You'll note, if you have the book, there's 6 other goals of NEPA. You can read those on your own, but the courts have determined those are unenforceable because they're too subjective. That doesn't mean they're not important. It just means the court doesn't know when an agency has met its goals and when it's met its mandate. So if you've never read NEPA and you're going to be doing real estate or you're going to be doing, other things with NEPA, it's only 5 pages and it's really easy to read. I recommend that you take a look at it. Especially take a look at both Section 1, the purpose, Section 101 and Section 102. Where did This is so like my keys, my glasses, my Okay, Section 102 is the part of NEPA that the courts do enforce. So it's referred to as the letter of the law. And in the letter of the law, what it says is every federal agency shall. So that's what makes it a legal requirement, that word shall. Utilize a systematic interdisciplinary approach to their analysis. Ensure unquantified environmental amenities are given appropriate consideration. Okay, here's another really, does this have a little red dot to it too? Oh, look at that. Ensure unquantified environmental amenities. What's an unquantified environmental amenity? Well, I kind of like people to think for themselves a little bit sometimes. Because if I just tell you and you don't think about it yourself for a little bit, you will forget what I have to say by this time next week.
Flowers growing in a field.
Yep, perfect example. Flowers growing in a field. And it's unquantifiable because the value that you put on it, and your name is Crystal. The value that Crystal puts on it versus the value I put on it is different. So we can't really, you might say, well, that's worth $3 million to me. And I might say, well, that's worth $2 million to me. Now, if they tried to get that money from us, they wouldn't get it from us, but, well, they wouldn't get it from me anyway. I don't know about you, Crystal, but it's those things that people have different values for. So a lot of times vistas are considered unquantifiable amenities because some people will look and they'll see, mountains and, yeah, those are mountains, they're nice. And some people will, have this, like when I first saw them, this serious connection that I felt to them, that I was living in Minnesota at the time, and I went out to Colorado, and I said, I have to live in the mountains. I have to be a part of the mountains. And now I'm feeling that way about the ocean. So I've had 26 years in the mountains. It's those things. So air quality, water quality, people put different values on that. They are unquantifiable amenities. Now, we can quantify those, right? We can quantify how many acres of flowers there are and what kind of flowers are within there and whether there's invasive species or not. All of that can be quantified. Water quality can be quantified. Air quality can be quantified. But the values that different people put on them cannot be quantified. And that's what NEPA requires you to do. It requires that when agencies look at the environment, they don't just quantify what the impacts are, but they look at those values that people are putting on those resources, ecosystems, and communities that they live in, and how this is affecting those values. It also then requires documentation. So there's 3 levels of documentation that I'll talk about, and all of them require this to some extent. So the documentation includes what are the environmental impacts of the proposed action and any alternatives. What are the adverse environmental effects which cannot be avoided? Are there alternatives to this proposed action? The relationship between the short-term uses and long-term productivity of the resources and any irreversible or irretrievable impacts. So a couple of definitions I want to give you. This term proposed action is really confusing, and it shouldn't be. It's simply the first alternative that the agency or the tribe came up with to meet the need, whatever problem they've identified. It's just an alternative. It's not the preferred alternative, which is what a lot of people think. It's just an alternative. It's the very first one they came up with to try and solve the problem. And then we go from this proposed action into alternatives to that proposed action. You're looking confused, Crystal, is there? Okay. So in NEPA, you're required to look at alternatives, right? Whoops. You're required to look at alternatives. So, see, there's alternatives to the proposed action. So we develop that proposed action, and then we say, okay, this is one way we could do this. Now, let's take this and look at, are there other ways we could approach this? Because this one is going to go in the middle of a wetland. Probably not the best alternative or way of approaching this, solving this problem. What if we move it over a quarter of a mile and avoid the wetland, and now we have 2 alternatives? But now maybe that one goes through some critical habitat. Or, so you're looking at what are the different ways we can approach solving this problem we've identified and doing it with the least amount of environmental damage. That's what the purpose of those alternatives is, to figure out, can we do this with less environmental damage? Can we do this with less cost? And can we do this with better technology so that we have less damage? Does that help? Okay. Oh, and then I was going to also, irreversible and irretrievable. Those terms basically mean, and most of the time in NEPA, you'll see that the practitioners of NEPA have no clue what those mean. And I don't recommend people use them because nobody knows what they mean. But just so you guys know, irreversible means gone for good. We fill in a wetland, it's gone for good. We're not getting that wetland back. If we fill in a wetland and we put a Walmart on top of it, it's not coming back again. Irretrievable, on the other hand, are those things, so we're gonna go do timber harvesting and we're gonna put some temporary roads in. Both the timber harvest and the temporary roads are irretrievable in the sense that right after we've cut the trees, they're no longer habitat for migratory birds. But they'll come back again. They'll grow again. And depending, if you're in Utah, it might take 50, 100 years. If you're in southern Oregon, it might take 20 years, depending upon where you are. But they'll be back again. If you really can keep that road temporary, Mother Nature will take it back again. Things will start growing in there again if people aren't taking their four-wheelers out there and ripping it up. So that's irretrievable in the sense that it's gone for a while. It's not retrievable for a while, but it comes back again. So those are the kinds of impact, we're trying to avoid the irreversible as much as possible. The irretrievable, we're trying to make it so it comes back as soon as possible. And that we don't damage it to the point that when you clear cut, now you've removed all habitat for migratory birds in that particular area. And you've also potentially removed habitat for a lot of other wildlife in that area for the next 20 to 50 years. If you can do selective cutting, there's still habitat there. So it's a matter of trying to take a look at how you can reduce the impacts. So the twin aims of NEPA, which you probably can't see that very well, it was supposed to be black, is consider, which means consider the environment, and can't read that one either, but that right there says inform. Consider the environment and inform the federal agencies and their public about what the impacts are. So consider the environment and inform everybody who's affected on why they should care about this. So, I should trust myself. I usually don't mess up that much. So, the CEQ, or Council on Environmental Quality. How many of you have ever heard of the CEQ? Just so you know, when I ask federal agencies that, this is the same response I get from them, which is always a little scary to me. Not scary that you guys don't understand it, but when a federal law is passed, they always appoint a federal agency to oversee and regulate that law. So, for example, with the Endangered Species Act, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Services were the agencies that regulate that. With NEPA, the Council on Environmental Quality was established with NEPA, and its purpose at the time was more or less to be the environmental watchdog for the United States. And they were for a while, and then, so they were created on January 1st, 1970. The Environmental Protection Agency was created on December 1st of 1970, and the roles got switched. So the CEQ, the Council on Environmental Quality is not a federal agency. They are a member of the President's Cabinet. They're an executive, they're part of the executive branch. So they weren't given any authority, and when a agency is given the regulating authority for a law, they are required to write regulations that implement the law. In other words, explain how you have to comply with, what it takes to comply with this law. The CEQ regulations were not established for implementing NEPA until 1978 through an executive order because they weren't a federal agency. So, but they're really, really important. And for those of you who have a book, now I don't want to walk past this again, so did either of you guys get a book? made me really nervous. Wayne, can I borrow yours for just a second? I'll look at it with you. So if you go to past the act itself, and you go to page, they actually start on page 68, where the table of contents is. And then if you go to page 71, she has to share with you. Okay. You will see that we have the purpose of the law. So there's just 3 of them I want to reinforce for you. Now, the one thing I do want to reinforce is if you're going to be doing NEPA, if you really want to understand how to comply with NEPA, you have to read the CEQ regulations. And I'm not punishing you for being a NEPA person by telling you that, okay? They're very easy to read. They're not written in horrible legalese like the ESA is. They're very easy to read, but they tell you how to comply with the requirements that Section 102 of the law and how to meet the goal of NEPA. So I read them every year and they haven't changed. There's been one change. NEPA's never been amended, and there's just been one change to the CEQ regs, and that was back in '86 when they took out worst case scenario. So they stay the same. I read them every year just to remind myself of what they say, because as I'm getting older, things are moving out of one side as they slowly try to trickle in on the other side. So if you go to page 71 and you look at section 1500.1, the purpose, it says, the National Environmental Policy Act is our basic national charter for the protection of the environment. It establishes policy, sets goals, which is section 101, and provides means for carrying out the policy. Section 102.2 contains action-forcing provisions to make sure that federal agencies act according to the letter and the spirit of the act. The regulations that follow implement Section 102.2. Their purpose is to tell federal agencies what they must do to comply with all procedures and achieve the goals of the act. The President, the federal agencies, and the courts share responsibility for enforcing the act so as to achieve the substantive requirements of Section 101. B, NEPA procedures must ensure that environmental information is available to the public officials and citizens before decisions are made and before actions are taken. The information must be of high quality. Accurate scientific analysis, expert agency comments, and public scrutiny are essential to implementing NEPA. Most important, NEPA documents must concentrate on the issues that are truly significant to the action in question rather than amassing needless detail. C, ultimately, of course, it's not better documents but better decisions that count. NEPA's purpose is not to generate paperwork, even excellent paperwork, but to foster excellent action. The NEPA process is intended to help public officials make decisions that are based on the understanding of the environmental consequences and to take actions that protect, restore, and enhance the environment. These regulations provide the directions to achieve this purpose. So to me, that clearly states NEPA is not just a procedural law, that you should be protecting, enhancing, and restoring the environment. But the Supreme Court never asked my opinion on it before they made theirs, so I guess I just have to respectfully disagree at this point. So that's the purpose of these CEQ regulations. And that's why they're so important if you're going to do NEPA, that you take a look at them. I'm not talking that you memorize them, but that you think, I think I saw something in the regulations that can help us answer this question, and then go to the regulations. 1500.4, reducing paperwork. So how many of you have reviewed a NEPA document? Not yet? Okay. You know how big they can get, right? I mean, it used to be that they were this big, they were too small. Now they're this, I mean, well, honestly, I've seen a NEPA document that was 10 volumes, and it stood from the table here this high. Who's going to read that? Nobody's going to read that. That's just ridiculous. Frankly, anything over 200 pages is probably not going to get read by the vast majority of people who should be reading it, like the people in the tribes who it's affecting. So, reducing paperwork, 1500.4, which is on page. Wait, I'm trying not to lick my fingers and. And I'm not gonna read all of these, but these are just some of the ways that you can recommend if an agency gives you a document that's 500 pages, you should complain. You should say this isn't acceptable to us. This should not be 500 pages. It means that you're putting information in here that's not really relevant, or you're amassing needless detail. So some of the ways they recommend that you reduce the length of environmental impact statements is by means such as setting appropriate limits. Now, I work with a lot of tribes who do the NEPA documents, and it doesn't sound like you guys are doing that at this point, but that you can actually do NEPA documents for things that you're proposing that require federal funding. Now, it's still going to be the BIA or the agency's document, but you can offer to do it for them, and then they adopt it as their own. And if you are, to me, as a team leader, that's one of the first things I always did is said, okay, we got to talk about setting page limits, because I don't know how many of you are wildlife biologists in here, but they can go on for a long time. They can have 25 pages on something only to find out that there's no impacts on wildlife. And we don't want that. So setting page limits, preparing analytic rather than encyclopedic documents. What that means is if we're talking about affecting a migratory bird, we don't really care what color of eyes that bird has, how many toes it has, when it molts in the spring and starts, none of that. We aren't changing it. That's encyclopedic information. All we want to know is if we're affecting that bird's mating habitat, when do they mate? How long does it take that we have to stay out of that area? Or if we're affecting their breeding, their babies, how long what's that process called? The rearing of wildlife when there's a name for it. We don't have wildlife biologists in here, do we? I want to call it the pupping season, but that's not right. Anyway, if we're affecting its rearing of its young, then we need to know how we can reduce our effects on that, whether it be time of year, whether it be chemicals we're using, whatever the case may be. So focusing on the effects, and then discussing briefly only issues other than significant, and writing environmental impact statements in plain language, and following a clear format for the document so that the information flows smoothly. Oh, wait, I have one more. Would you flip to 1502.5? Okay. The last one, I'm not going to read all of that, just like that. Those are the most important ones. In 1502.5, it talks about the timing of when we should be doing NEPA. So that is you're going to find that on page 86, halfway down, 1502.5, timing. An agency shall commence preparation of an environmental impact statement as close as possible to the time the agency is developing or presented with a proposal. so that the preparation can be completed in time for the final statement to be included in any recommendation or report on the proposal. The statement shall be prepared early enough so that it can serve practically as an important contribution to the decision-making process and will not be used to justify or rationalize decisions already made. Which about 80% of all NEPA documents do. So thank you, Wayne. It's important that we look at that when we are reviewing these documents to see if the agency has already made a decision and now this document is focused on that one alternative, which is usually called the proposed action. Are they focusing on that one alternative? And dang it. I'm sorry, you guys. Yes. What a mess. That's what I have to say. So her question was, what about Standing Rock? So that is why the judge told them that their document was insufficient and that they had to go back and redo it. So they did lose in court. But with Standing Rock, what they also did was, well, there were a number of things with Standing Rock. Yeah, it's a hard one. They screwed up really badly on Standing Rock, and what they did with Standing Rock. So the oil company, the oil and gas company, came up with their proposal. Okay, they proposed an action, and then the Army Corps of Engineers and FERC more or less went with the action they proposed instead of taking a really hard look at it and making sure it incorporated what it should have incorporated. So for example, originally the pipeline was going to go across the Missouri River where Bismarck got their drinking water, and the people in Bismarck said, no way, we don't accept that. So they did change that. They moved it over to where the Sioux get their drinking water. And when the Sioux said no way, they said too bad. And when the bottom line, they screwed the Sioux. They did. The tribe had every right to be furious with what the Corps did and with what FERC did, because they were more concerned about the Bismarck community, and they sacrificed their lands instead. NEPA doesn't tell you what you can and cannot do. The Clean Water Act tells you what you can and cannot do. NEPA just says you have to inform people, and you have to take a hard look at all of the alternatives that are reasonable. And then the decision maker can make the decision. Other acts actually say no. NEPA doesn't say no. It says you have to look at alternatives, and you have to explain those alternatives equally and give enough detail so people see the differences between them. But ultimately, the decision lies with the federal agency, and as long as they're not breaking any other laws, they can make any choice they want. So my feeling is that doesn't comply completely with the restoring, avoiding, reducing impacts, which it seems to me NEPA is saying they're supposed to be doing. And they did. They did put mitigation measures in there, but not. The mitigations were more to help others, not the tribe. And the tribe's the one who got dumped on. Yes. So the Army Corps of Engineers. Don't tell me my time is almost up. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Judy asked, isn't one of the problems that the Corps went with an environmental assessment instead of an environmental impact statement? So an environmental assessment basically says, we don't think there's going to be any significant impacts. And so an environmental impact statement says we will have significant impacts. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. And yes, you're right. So they stuck with the environmental assessment, though, Judy, and it's 1,200 pages. If you have a 1,200-page environmental assessment, it means you're having significant impacts and you should be doing an EIS. So I think that's still in court, actually, that part of it. But I think everybody's pretty sick of it at this point, too, and isn't really pushing. So under the law, NEPA, if people don't feel that a federal agency has complied with NEPA, the Administrative Procedures Act allows private citizens being affected by the action to sue the federal government for non-compliance with NEPA, or any other federal law for that matter. It also requires that federal agencies involve the public in their decision-making process. NEPA also requires that. So, and then what the courts look at is, was the decision arbitrary and capricious? And so, Judy, that's where this came in. So it is not supported by logic or the necessary facts. So that EA, the court said, at this point, a FONSI, a finding of no significant impact after the environmental assessment, is not logical. And it's not supported by what you put in that EA. It's arbitrary and capricious decision. Go back and take another look at it. Or it's adopted without thought or reason. It's irrational. Often that means they forgot to include things. So one of the first things that they forgot to include that made the original decision arbitrary and capricious is they didn't include any of the concerns that the tribe had expressed about sacred sites, traditional cultural properties, water quality, potential spills on their properties. And so that was another reason that they had to go back and redo it. Although that actually ended up badly for the Sioux because they did identify traditional cultural properties and sacred sites on both the federal lands and the private lands that the oil company owned. And I don't know if you know it, but then the oil company came in on Sunday morning and bulldozed those sites. So it didn't really pay for the tribe to identify those because they destroyed them anyway. Did I leave my clicker thing again? Good thing somebody's keeping an eye. Thank you. Scoping process. This is the public involvement process along with everything else that they do in order to determine what are the concerns that the people within the tribe have. And now remember, when it comes to federal agencies doing things on tribal lands, the tribe, the members of the tribe are their public. So if something's being done, you know, on your lands, I can't come in there and sue the federal government. Only the tribal members can. Only the tribal members can make comments about it. Now, if it's doing something that affects things on both tribal lands and off tribal lands, then the public becomes greater. But if it's just on your lands and it's just on your resources, the tribe is the public. And this is how the NEPA process begins. And it needs to begin right at the very beginning, because you can't use it as a planning process if it comes in after the fact for you to justify something you've already made. So NEPA must come in right at the very beginning of the process so we can honestly look at alternatives and we can honestly figure out, are there other ways of doing this that reduce the impacts? And the purpose of this scoping process is to determine what actions are being taken, what are the reasonable alternatives, and then what are both the beneficial and adverse impacts associated with it. And we need the beneficial and adverse impacts so we can weigh. The decision maker can say, okay, here's the beneficial, here's the adverse, how do they weigh out? So it includes consultation with the tribe, as well as with other federal agencies. It might include state agencies, particularly like the Department of Water Quality, the Department of Natural Resource, Wildlife and Fisheries. But there are different definitions of consultation depending upon, under NEPA, depending upon their NEPA regulations. So I used the National Park Services because it's just, it's just an example. Consultation means the process of seeking, discussing, and considering the views of others, and, where feasible, seeking agreement with them on how historic properties should be identified, considered, and managed. Consultation is built upon the exchange of ideas, not simply providing information. And that's one of the reasons I picked it. Federal agencies are really good at informing us, but they're not always so good at involving us. Involving comes long before the informing process takes place. Involving means that they haven't got themselves so set in a particular way that they can't incorporate new alternatives or new actions within the alternatives they're looking at, like mitigation measures. So public involvement means they come in early enough to get your ideas, to get your thoughts, to understand your concerns, so they can be incorporated into that draft document when they're trying to inform you of what it is that they're thinking about doing. Government-to-government consultation means that the process starts with the decision maker from the federal agency talking to the decision maker from the tribal entity. And under the Obama administration, they made some changes, which I don't know how your tribal leaders feel about this, but now federal agencies have to send the initial consultation letter from the agency's decision maker to the tribal leaders. And some of the tribal leaders I've talked to said, you know, we get a ton of mail, and we don't look through all of it. And we count on our cultural resource people and our natural resource people to keep us informed about what agencies are doing. So if we're your first contact, it may take months before it ever trickles down, and that's not going to work for us. So most agencies now have recognized that, and they'll CC, so it'll go to the tribal leaders, but then they'll CC the cultural and natural resource specialists that they work with so that they're aware of it, and then can come to the tribal leaders and say, this is one where you probably want to get involved, or this is one where we can work it out without you. But they are doing that. And when it does come to that point, there's a couple things to think about from the tribal perspective. One is that they cannot put unfunded mandates on you. So if they want the tribe to do something, they need to fund it. The second thing is they really should be coming to you rather than asking the tribe to come to them for meetings. And I know there's a few agencies that have put into their NEPA regulations that if they're going to ask the tribe to come to them, they have to pay the expenses of the tribe. And if I were a tribe member, that's what I would be expecting. Either you come to us because this is your stuff, or if you want us to come to you, then you pay our way to come to you. And that they can't break a treaty, okay? Treaties are a federal law, and no agency has the authority to do something that would infringe upon treaty rights. That's a no-no. Anything that would do that is off the table. So that's something to be looking at. How is this affecting your treaty rights? And then, in addition to treaty rights, also be looking at how things are affecting the water quality, the air quality, wildlife habitat that people within the tribe are reliant on for their hunting and fishing and gardening and, whatever purposes. None, that's all part of the deal. So in that exchange of information, it's up to the tribe to make sure you stand up for your rights and that you ensure that you make sure they explain things well enough to you that you have a clear understanding of what they think the problem is and what they think the solutions are. Now, I'm going to suggest to you, before they've even developed that problem, they should be talking to you because we need different perspectives on problems. If I look at a problem, I'm going to look at it from my lenses. If Crystal looks at a problem, she's going to look at it from her lenses. If I can remember, if Carol looks at a problem, she's going to look at it from her lens. So, and it might be that it's coming from a botanist, it might be coming from a cultural resource perspective, it might be coming from a legal perspective. You need all those perspectives. If you're going to see the big picture, you need all those perspectives defining the problem, because if it's water quality, the soil biologist is going to say, we got to look at vegetation. And then the wildlife person is going to say, well, yeah, but we also have to look at the wildlife. You know how this is going to cause a problem for the wildlife. And then the botanist says, well, we've got endangered plants out there too, and we've got to be concerned about those because, like, the Utes have some of the last of a particular plant found only in their area on their reservation. We don't want to lose that. So you need to look at it from different perspectives, both the problems and the solutions and the impacts, in order to really see the big problem. So they should be coming to you before they've even fully defined the problem they want to solve. And they should be coming to you and asking for advice on solutions to those problems, or alternatives as they're called in NEPA. And then compliance with Section 106 is, that Section 106 consultation ending with a memorandum of agreement. That memorandum of agreement is a legal document, a legal agreement that's enforceable by the courts. I already said that first bullet has to be completed before they can issue a final document or make a decision. The EA or EIS needs to include a copy of any kind, memorandum of agreement or any kind of agreement you came to, and it should also include the date that the consultation began and the date it was completed. And any information on sacred sites, archaeological sites, traditional cultural properties has to remain out of it'll say there are traditional sites, traditional cultural properties or archaeological sites within the area, but they aren't identified either in the document or in their files that can go out to the public. And that's really important. You make sure that they don't do that, because that's how things get, like that archaeologist who identified those, now they were on private lands. So he or she probably won't get in trouble, but ethically, that was completely unethical for their profession, as well as just life in general. Yeah. So, the types of NEPA documents. So, categorical exclusions. Have you heard of those? Who was it, you, Judy, who said this? This is what everybody wants to do. No, we don't. Actually, no, we don't. We don't necessarily want to do this, but we can do this. So every federal agency has their own NEPA implementing regulations. So you've got the implementing regulations that the CEQ has. So you've got the act itself they have to comply with, the CEQ, the Council on Environmental Quality Regulations that you, those of you with the book, now have a copy of. And then every agency has their own NEPA implementing regulations. The BIA has pretty extensive information in their implementing regulations about how they're going to work with federal agencies. So if you're working with the BIA, you should download a copy of that. All you have to do is Google BIA NEPA implementing regulations, and you can get a copy of it. So, and within those regulations, every agency has their own list of actions that they have determined do not have the potential for significant impacts, so they don't have to do a full-blown NEPA on it. Some of them, they don't, they can just see it in there and then they can move forward. Other ones, they have to look at what are called extraordinary circumstances. So for certain things, especially anything where you're going to be digging in the ground, you have to look to see, are there wetlands there? Are there cultural resources there? Are there endangered species there? And they have a list of, and they're pretty similar between the agencies, but they have to go through this list of potential circumstances that I've explained here that could result in them moving away from a categorical exclusion. Because with a categorical exclusion, it means no public involvement, it means no actual analysis. They identify the problem, and they move forward with their solution, and that's all they have to do. Unless one of these extraordinary circumstances happens. And the second one is a lot of public controversy. So if there's a lot of concern within the tribe about this, they may have to move into an EA. An EA, or an environmental assessment, is the next step in NEPA. So this is when an agency is determining, are you going to tell me I'm almost done? Okay. So an environmental assessment is when we can't do a categorical exclusion, but we don't know if there will be significant impacts or not. So the purpose of an EA is to determine, are there significant impacts? And if there are, then we move into the next step, which is an environmental impact statement. If there are none, the analysis was done, there's no significant impacts, and so they can do what's called a finding of no significant impacts, or a FONSI. That's the decision document. And then you have environmental impact statements where the agency knows, so they're going to allow a copper mine on your lands. They should be doing an environmental impact statement. That's going to have significant impacts. And a significant impact means that they are pushing a resource, an ecosystem, or a community to a point that it no longer functions the way it historically functioned. So if you are looking at water quality within a stream, and we're going to be putting in enough sediment into that stream from something that it's going to change the water quality as well as increase water temperatures. And we've had 5 or 10 different species of fish in that river, and populations have been declining, and now you're going to push one of the species to the point that it's no longer going to have the genetic diversity that it needs in order to be able to reproduce in a healthy way, then that's a significant impact to fish populations, and you're doing an environmental impact statement. Even if you're not having significant impacts to any other thing. So there you're having significant impacts to water, and you're having significant impacts to the species that are dependent on that water. Then you have to check, are we having significant impacts on terrestrial wildlife if we do that? Are we having significant impacts on recreation or anglers if we do that? So that's where that domino effect takes place. And if you have significant impacts on one aspect of an ecosystem, it's likely that you're going to be affecting others enough that you should be considering them potentially significant. And then this process ends in a record of decision. Normally, an environmental assessment is between 50 and 100 pages. It takes between 6 to 18 months to do, and it costs anywhere from $10,000 to $250,000. An environmental impact statement never costs less than $1 million. It usually takes 2.5 years to complete, and it should run between 150 and 200 pages. Here's what the primary function of these documents are. It's to make sure that the decision maker has the information needed to be able to consider the environment in their decision-making process, that it shows everybody they did the process correctly, they did good science, and it informs the public who are affected and interested in the action. This is what goes into EAs and EISs. So you've got a cover sheet, basically just tells you who the agency is, what level of documentation, the date it's being done. It's these, whoops. The purpose and need for the action, which is Chapter 1, alternatives including the proposed action, affected environment, and environmental consequences. Those are the 4 chapters that are most important and that the courts look at. So in the purpose and need, it summarizes what's the problem. Who is proposing to do what, where, and when. That what in there is going to, I don't have that up here yet. Yeah, the what. The what here is just the basic proposal. We're going to be putting in a new road to a new house, we're going to be putting in a new housing development that will include somewhere between 15 and 20 new homes, an access road from Highway 2 that's about 5 miles long, and it will be asphalted. The rest of it we leave open enough so that we can have alternative ways of how we do that. We don't state where that road's going to be yet at this point because we haven't analyzed where might be the best place to put it. We have a variation on the number of houses because we don't know yet what's the best number for the needs for the tribe versus the needs to ensure that we don't destroy wetlands or we don't destroy, I know the ESA doesn't apply, but I know most tribes actually do implement their own kind of endangered species, preventing the elimination of endangered species on their land. So, so that what is just a proposal. And then the need explains, here's the problem. So let's talk about housing development. Let's say that we currently have 2,000 people on the reservation, and we have enough housing for 1,500 people. So we're short 500. We're short housing for 500 people. That's the problem. The current condition is that we're short 500. The desired condition is we have enough housing for everybody who needs and wants housing. And so the agency is the, who does HUD? So the Housing and Urban Development people come in, and they have to look at what is their mission. So their mission is to help ensure that there's enough housing for people. That's one of their missions. And then they have to look at what are the needs for this community, for this tribe. And they'll also look at this point, what are the other laws involved, like Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, et cetera. And then under that comes the list of objectives. Once we do this, what do we hope to achieve? So, and again, all of this should be done with members of the tribe. The what should be done with members of the tribe, the need should be done with members of the tribe giving their input, and the objectives. The objectives are, what do we hope to achieve by accomplishing that, or what do we hope to achieve once we've completed this project? And maybe under these circumstances, it will be, we hope to ensure that we provide housing for at least between 300 and 400 people. It will still be short, but that's, when we look at the funding that we have, that's the best we can do. And still ensure that we have good, solid houses. It might be, so it's tied both into the need, and then it might also be tied into the issues. So it might be that we also want to ensure that we're not building on wetlands, or that we're not building on critical habitat for an endangered species, or that we're not destroying, deer habitat, or whatever, some of the issues might be. This determines what's a reasonable alternative. These two things, that need, meeting that need and meeting these objectives, determine if an alternative is reasonable or not. If it doesn't meet the need or the objectives, it's not a reasonable alternative. So you want to really ensure that those are well covered. So a reasonable alternative meets the need and meets the purpose and need. It has to be financially and technologically feasible, so it has to be within their budget. It can't violate other environmental laws, and there must be an interdisciplinary approach to developing the alternatives. There's a requirement for a no-action alternative, because that's a baseline for the agency to compare. If we do nothing, here's what happens, and if we take action, here's how that differs. It should include what it's going to take to implement the actions, so we can take that information to determine what the impacts are going to be. It should include mitigation measure, which means we avoid, we reduce, we rectify, or we compensate for impacts. And then list alternatives that were eliminated because they didn't meet one of the requirements. And then it should identify the preferred alternative. Now, under the BIA requirements for public involvement, the tribe's preferred alternative is supposed to be the BIA's preferred alternative. So make sure you let them know that. Chapter 3 identifies the current ecosystem and how healthy each of the aspects of that ecosystem are, and what their trend is, and how much they can withstand impacts that might be occurring because of the action. And Chapter 4 talks about the impacts? What are the direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts affecting those same resources? And are they beneficial or adverse? Are they short-term or long-term? And within this analysis, you should be looking at how are we changing things from that current condition quantifiably and unquantifiably? How are we changing things from the current condition when we look at the impacts associated with each of the alternatives? So that's basically bottom line. Quickly, I know my time's up. That's the NEPA process. And that's what goes into a NEPA document, and really, take away from this that NEPA is about making sure the environment is considered in the decision and making sure that the people who are affected by those impacts have the opportunity to say something about those effects and give their opinions and share their knowledge, and that gets incorporated into that decision-making process also. Okay. I know I didn't go through all my slides, but you guys can look at them. And like I said, I get very ambitious when I'm putting this together, thinking I can do way more than I actually can.
Does anybody have any questions for Judy? All right, so this was the introduction to NEPA, and thank you, Judy, very much. At 1 o'clock, she will be back in here for NEPA as a planning tool. So if you're really interested in NEPA and want to learn more about it, come back at 1. We'll both be in here. I would just like to remind you that lunch begins at 12 o'clock today. It will be in the main ballroom again. Could you please complete the session evaluation forms? They're the little half-sheet yellow forms on your desk. And then be sure to visit the exhibitor booths and enter into the raffle for your chance to win on Thursday. After our lunch, we'll be drawing for the raffle prizes. So go ahead and get everything stamped by all the exhibitors and turn in your card that was in your registration bag.
I'm going to also make I don't know how to describe. I'm not a marketer, but I am doing a course in Las Vegas next month for 3 days called NEPA with Native American emphasis. So it's meant for tribes and people working with tribes. It'll be in Las Vegas in, I think, the week of April 13th, if any of you are interested. Well, you usually have to come to the course, but just give me your name and address, and I'll send you one. Really, you guys have no questions? I'm amazed. Does that mean because I did such a great job of explaining it? Or did I baffle you so much that you're kind of lost in your thoughts now? I'm sorry.